The gunshot echoed across the empty plains, startling a flock of crows into flight as Parker Neill lowered his rifle, squinting against the harsh Arizona sun. The jackrabbit he'd been aiming for darted away unscathed, leaving him with nothing to show for his morning hunt but wasted ammunition and a growling stomach. It had been 3 days since his last proper meal, and the pantry in his isolated cabin was as barren as the surrounding desert. But food wasn't what troubled Parker most on this sweltering August morning in 1873. It was the crushing solitude that had become his only companion since returning from a war that had ended 8 years ago, but still raged within him. Parker wiped the sweat from his brow and gathered his meager belongings. He hadn't always lived this way, cut off from civilization in a ramshackle cabin 10 miles outside of Gila City, Arizona territory. There was a time when he'd been a respected rancher with a promising future, a man who smiled easily and slept through the night without being haunted by the faces of fallen comrades. The war between the states had changed everything, turning him from a hopeful young man into a hollow shell who flinched at sudden noises and preferred the company of his horse to that of other people. As Parker trudged back toward his cabin, the merciless sun beating down on his broad shoulders, he noticed something unusual in the distance, a cloud of dust on the horizon, moving steadily in his direction. Visitors were rare out here, and rarely welcome. His hand instinctively moved to the revolver holstered at his hip as he quickened his pace, determined to reach the relative safety of his cabin before whoever was approaching arrived. By the time the wagon came into view, Parker was standing on his porch, rifle in hand, his weathered face set in a scowl that had become his default expression over the years. The approaching vehicle was a simple horse-drawn wagon with a single occupant, a woman, from what he could tell at this distance. This was unexpected and unwelcome. Women didn't venture out to his cabin. Nobody did, and that was precisely how he preferred it. As the wagon drew closer, Parker could make out more details. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, with chestnut hair partially concealed beneath a bonnet. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, and she handled the reins with confidence, suggesting she was no stranger to driving a wagon alone. When she was about 20 yards away, she raised a hand in greeting, an uncertain smile on her face. "That's far enough," Parker called out, his voice rough from disuse. "State your business." The woman pulled the wagon to a halt, looking slightly taken aback by his hostile reception. "Mr. Neill," she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "Parker Neill." Parker stiffened, his finger twitching near the trigger of his rifle. Few people knew his name, and even fewer knew where to find him. "Who's asking?" he responded gruffly. "My name is Hannah Walsh," she replied, sitting up straighter on the wagon seat. "I've recently moved to Gila City. She hesitated. "I'm the new baker in town. Sheriff Thompson mentioned you live out here alone, and I thought you might appreciate some fresh bread." Parker's scowl deepened. Old Thompson had no business telling strangers about him, especially not pretty widows with kind eyes. He could tell she was a widow from the black ribbon on her bonnet, though the rest of her clothing suggested she'd been in mourning for some time. "I don't need charity," Parker said flatly, but his stomach chose that moment to growl loudly enough that he wondered if she could hear it from where she sat. Hannah Walsh's expression softened, but not with pity, with understanding. "It's not charity, Mr. Neill. It's being neighborly. And if you must know, I'm trying to build a reputation in town. If the man who fought at Gettysburg enjoys my bread, it might help my business." Parker blinked in surprise. How did she know he'd fought at Gettysburg? Thompson had a loose tongue indeed. Still, the mention of fresh bread made his mouth water involuntarily. It had been years since he'd tasted proper, freshly baked bread. After a long, tense moment, Parker lowered his rifle slightly. "You can come closer," he conceded reluctantly, "but make it quick. I've got things to do." A small smile appeared on Hannah's face as she clicked her tongue, urging her horse forward. The wagon creaked as it rolled the remaining distance to his cabin. When she pulled up in front of his porch, Parker could smell the bread before he even saw it, a rich, yeasty aroma that made his stomach contract painfully with hunger. Hannah climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease, smoothing her skirts before reaching back to retrieve a cloth-covered basket. "2 loaves," she explained as she approached the porch, stopping at the bottom step and looking up at him. "1 sourdough and 1 with dried herbs from my garden. Still warm if you'd like to try some now." Parker stood frozen, unsure how to respond to this unexpected kindness. Up close, he could see that Hannah Walsh was quite beautiful, with intelligent hazel eyes and a smattering of freckles across her nose. She was slender but strong-looking, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work. Nothing like the pampered Southern belles he'd known in his youth, nor the hardened barmaids who occasionally tried to catch his eye on his infrequent visits to town. "Why are you really here?" Parker asked suspiciously, unable to believe that someone would ride 10 miles from town simply to deliver bread to a stranger. Hannah's smile faltered slightly, but she met his gaze directly. "As I said, I'm new in Gila City. Been there 3 months. The sheriff mentioned there was a war veteran living out here alone who rarely comes to town. My husband." Her voice caught momentarily. "My late husband was at Shiloh, Confederate side. He never really came home from the war, even though he lived for 5 more years after it ended. I know what it's like to live with someone haunted by what they've seen." She held up the basket. "Sometimes, a small kindness can make a difference. That's all." Parker felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: recognition. This woman understood, at least partially, what it meant to be broken by war. Not directly, but through the man she'd loved. The realization made him uncomfortable, exposed in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. "Come up, then," he said gruffly, setting his rifle aside but keeping it within reach. "I've got coffee on the stove. Might be bitter by now, but it's hot." Hannah nodded and climbed the steps, still keeping a respectful distance between them as she held out the basket. Parker took it, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. The simple human contact, even so brief, sent an unexpected jolt through him. How long had it been since he'd touched another person? "Thank you," he muttered, lifting the cloth to reveal 2 golden-brown loaves that looked like something from another world compared to the hardtack and jerky that constituted most of his diet. "You're welcome, Mr. Neill," Hannah replied, folding her hands in front of her. "I should be getting back to town before it gets too late. The roads aren't always safe for a woman alone." Parker glanced at the sky, noting that the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The thought of this woman traveling alone as darkness fell, possibly encountering bandits or wild animals, stirred something protective in him that he'd thought long dead. "You shouldn't have come out this far by yourself," he said, more harshly than he intended. "It's not safe." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "I've been taking care of myself for quite some time, Mr. Neill, but I appreciate your concern." Parker shifted uncomfortably, then gestured toward his cabin door. "At least have some coffee before you go, and you can call me Parker." "Mr. Neill makes me sound like my father." A genuine smile brightened Hannah's face, transforming it in a way that made Parker's breath catch. "I'd like that, Parker, and you should call me Hannah." As they entered his small, sparse cabin, Parker was suddenly, acutely aware of how primitive his living conditions were. The single room contained little more than a bed, a table with two mismatched chairs, and a pot-bellied stove. His few possessions were neatly organized, a trait ingrained from his military days, but the floor needed sweeping, and the window was coated with dust and grime. "Sorry about the state of things," he mumbled, hurriedly removing a pile of mending from one of the chairs. "Don't get many visitors." "No need to apologize," Hannah said gently, taking the offered seat. "It's a fine home." Parker busied himself with pouring coffee into the only 2 cups he owned, grateful for the distraction. Having a woman in his cabin, this woman in particular was stirring emotions and sensations he'd long suppressed. The scent of lavender mingled with baking bread that emanated from her was intoxicating after years of smelling nothing but his own sweat, leather, and gunpowder. When he placed the cup in front of her, Hannah reached into her basket and broke off a piece of the herb bread, offering it to him. "Try it," she encouraged. "Tell me if the rosemary is too strong." Parker took the bread, their fingers brushing again, and this time he didn't flinch away. He bit into it and couldn't suppress a groan of pleasure as the flavors exploded on his tongue, rich, yeasty bread infused with herbs and a hint of salt. It was quite possibly the most delicious thing he'd eaten in years. "It's good," he said simply, though good was a drastic understatement. "Very good." Hannah beamed with pride. "I'm glad you like it. Baking was one of the few skills I brought with me when I came west. I'm hoping to make a go of it with the bakery in town." "You're not from around here, then," Parker observed, breaking off another piece of bread. "Your accent Pennsylvania," Hannah nodded, looking impressed. "Yes, a small town near Philadelphia. You have a good ear." "Met a lot of folks from all over during the war," Parker explained, then immediately wished he hadn't mentioned it. The war wasn't something he discussed ever. But Hannah didn't press for war stories or ask which battles he'd fought in beyond Gettysburg. Instead, she sipped her coffee and asked, "Have you been in Arizona territory long?" Parker relaxed slightly. This was safer ground. "Since '67. Came west looking for a fresh start like most folks. Worked as a ranch hand for a while, then saved enough to build this place and run a few head of cattle, nothing fancy." "And you've been alone all that time?" Hannah asked, then quickly added, "I'm sorry, that's too personal a question." Parker surprised himself by answering anyway. "Yes." "Better that way." Hannah studied him over the rim of her cup, her hazel eyes thoughtful. "Is it?" The simple question hung in the air between them, and Parker found he had no ready answer. Was it better to be alone? It had seemed so for years. The only way he could manage the nightmares, the sudden rages, the crushing guilt of having survived when so many others hadn't. But sitting across from Hannah Walsh, sharing bread and coffee in his lonely cabin, he felt something crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Before he could formulate a response, Hannah glanced out the window at the darkening sky. "I really should be going," she said, rising from her chair. "Thank you for the coffee." Parker stood as well, suddenly reluctant to see her leave. "I'll ride with you back to town," he found himself saying. "Like you said, the roads aren't always safe." Hannah looked surprised but pleased. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to inconvenience you." "It's no inconvenience," Parker insisted, already reaching for his hat and gun belt. "Just give me a minute to saddle my horse." While Parker went to prepare his stallion, Thunder, Hannah waited on the porch, watching as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky. The isolation out here was profound, nothing but miles of desert and scrubland in all directions, with the distant mountains providing the only break in the horizon. She wondered how Parker could bear the solitude year after year. When he returned leading a magnificent black stallion, Hannah couldn't help but admire both the horse and its owner. In the fading light, With his tall frame silhouetted against the dusky sky, Parker Neill cut an impressive figure. Despite the lines of hardship etched into his face and the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, he was undeniably handsome in a rugged, weathered way. "Beautiful horse," she commented as he mounted up. Parker patted Thunder's neck with obvious affection. "Only friend I've needed," he said, though there was a note in his voice that suggested perhaps that wasn't entirely true. As they made their way toward Gila City, Hannah driving her wagon with Parker riding alongside, the vast desert landscape was transformed by the approaching night. Coyotes called in the distance, and the air grew cool as the heat of the day dissipated. They traveled mostly in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers, rather, it held a curious ease that neither had expected. "Why did you really come out to my cabin today?" Parker asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "And don't tell me it was just to deliver bread." Hannah considered her answer carefully. "The truth is, I've been baking for everyone in town, trying to establish myself and my business. Sheriff Thompson mentioned you when I asked if there was anyone I'd missed. He said you were a good man who'd seen too much during the war and preferred to be left alone. Something in the way he described you reminded me of James, my husband. I suppose I wanted to see for myself." "And now that you have?" Parker asked, his voice carefully neutral. Hannah glanced over at him, her expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "I think Sheriff Thompson was right about you being a good man. The rest remains to be seen." Parker didn't respond immediately, and when he did, he changed the subject. "Tell me about your bakery. Is business good?" Hannah allowed the deflection. "It's growing. I've taken over the old Miller place on Main Street, converted the front room into a shop, and live in the back. The mining operations bringing more people to the area has helped. Men working long hours don't have time to bake their own bread, and even the married ones seem to prefer mine to their wives, though I'd never say so to their faces." A ghost of a smile touched Parker's lips. "Based on what I tasted today, I'm not surprised." They continued their journey, exchanging small pieces of information about their lives. Hannah learned that Parker had grown up in Virginia, the second son of a moderately successful tobacco farmer, and had been studying to become a lawyer when the war broke out. Parker discovered that Hannah had lost not only her husband, but her young son to influenza 3 years ago, which had prompted her decision to leave Pennsylvania and start fresh in the West. By the time they reached the outskirts of Gila City, with its scattered buildings glowing with lamplight, Parker felt more at ease in Hannah's company than he'd felt with anyone in years. The town was quiet at this hour, with most respectable establishments closed and only the saloon showing signs of bustling activity. "That's my place," Hannah said, pointing to a small building with a freshly painted sign reading Walsh Bakery hanging above the door. "Would you like to come in for something to eat before you head back? It's a long ride." Parker hesitated. He'd already spent more time in human company today than he had in months, and the thought of entering town with its noise and people and memories made his chest tighten. "Better not," he said gruffly. "It's late." Hannah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Another time, perhaps." She guided her wagon up to the small stable behind her building and began to unhitch her horse. Parker dismounted and moved to help her, their hands working in tandem to free the tired mare from her harness. "Thank you for escorting me," Hannah said as they led the horse into the stable. "It wasn't necessary, but I appreciated the company." In the close confines of the stable, Parker was acutely aware of Hannah's proximity, of the subtle scent of lavender that clung to her clothing, of the way the moonlight streaming through the slats in the walls illuminated her profile. For a wild, disorienting moment, He wanted nothing more than to reach out and touch her face, to discover if her skin was as soft as it looked. He took a deliberate step back, clearing his throat. "I should get going." Hannah turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the shadows. "Will you come to town sometime? For supplies, perhaps? Or—" she hesitated. "Or just for a fresh loaf of bread." Parker should have said no. He should have mounted Thunder and ridden back to the solitude of his cabin without looking back. That was the safe choice, the choice that protected the fragile equilibrium he'd established over the years. Instead, he heard himself say, "Maybe." Hannah smiled, a gentle curving of lips that seemed to illuminate the darkness around them. "I'll look forward to it." She hesitated, then added, "The bread will be waiting whenever you're ready." They both knew she wasn't just talking about bread. Parker nodded once, then turned and mounted Thunder with fluid grace born of years in the saddle. "Good night, Hannah Walsh," he said, tipping his hat. "Good night, Parker Neill," she replied softly. "Ride safe." As Parker rode out of town, the night air cool against his face, he realized his hands were steady for the first time in as long as he could remember. The ever-present tremor that had plagued him since Gettysburg was temporarily stilled. He didn't allow himself to consider what that might mean, or why thoughts of a baker with hazel eyes and kind words kept intruding on his usual grim ruminations. One thing was certain, though the 10-mile ride back to his cabin had never seemed so long. The following week passed slowly for Parker. Each morning, he woke with the sun and performed his usual tasks, tending to his small herd of cattle, repairing fences, hunting for food, but his thoughts continually drifted to Hannah Walsh and the loaf of bread that still sat on his table, now growing stale. He'd rationed it carefully, eating just a small piece each day, savoring the flavor and the memory of the woman who had baked it. On the 8th day after Hannah's visit, Parker found himself standing before his cracked mirror, razor in hand, carefully scraping away the beard he'd worn for years. He didn't examine his motivations too closely, nor did he acknowledge the extra care he took in selecting his least worn shirt and brushing the dust from his good boots. He simply saddled Thunder and headed toward town, telling himself he needed supplies and nothing more. Gila City was bustling when Parker arrived. The mining operations in the surrounding hills had brought a steady influx of people to the once tiny settlement, and the main street was crowded with wagons, horses, and pedestrians going about their business. Parker felt his chest tighten as he dismounted in front of the general store, the noise and activity threatening to overwhelm his senses after so much solitude. He forced himself to breathe slowly, focusing on the task at hand. Supplies first, then. Well, he'd see about the bakery afterward. As he tied Thunder to the hitching post, he heard someone call his name. "Neill. Parker Neill, as I live and breathe." Parker turned to see Sheriff Thompson approaching, a broad grin on his weathered face. The older man had been kind to Parker over the years, respecting his need for privacy while occasionally checking that he was still alive during particularly harsh winters. "Sheriff," Parker acknowledged with a nod, shaking the offered hand. "Didn't expect to see you in town for another month at least," Thompson said, eyeing Parker's clean-shaven face and relatively presentable appearance with obvious curiosity. "Something bring you in special?" "Just supplies," Parker replied non-committally. Thompson's knowing smile suggested he wasn't fooled. Nothing to do with our new baker then. Heard she paid you a visit last week." Parker's jaw tightened. "News travels fast. Small town," Thompson shrugged. "And Mrs. Walsh mentioned she'd brought you some bread when she was asking after you yesterday." Parker's heart gave an unexpected lurch. "She asked about me, just wondering if I'd seen you, if you were well." Thompson's expression grew more serious. "She's a good woman, Parker." Been through a lot, from what I gather. Might do you both some good to have a friend." "I'm not looking for," Parker began, but Thompson held up a hand. I know. You prefer your own company. Just saying, there are worse things than letting someone care about you a little." He clapped Parker on the shoulder. "Anyway, glad to see you in town. Stay out of trouble." With a final knowing look, the sheriff continued on his way down the street. Parker stood motionless for a moment, Thompson's words echoing in his mind. With a sigh, he entered the general store and efficiently gathered the supplies he needed: coffee, sugar, ammunition, a few canned goods. He deliberately avoided looking in the direction of Walsh Bakery, though he was acutely aware of its location just 3 buildings down. After loading his purchases onto Thunder, Parker found himself with no further excuses to remain in town, and yet his feet carried him toward the bakery of their own accord. The aroma of fresh baked bread and sweet pastries enveloped him before he even reached the door, making his mouth water and his stomach growl in anticipation. Through the window, he could see Hannah moving about inside, her hair pinned up but with tendrils escaping to frame her face as she arranged goods on a counter. She wore a simple blue dress with a white apron, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek that Parker found inexplicably endearing. The shop appeared to be empty of other customers. Before he could lose his nerve, Parker pushed open the door, causing a small bell to jingle above his head. Hannah looked up at the sound, and the smile that spread across her face when she recognized him sent a warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with the heat from the ovens. "Parker," she said, wiping her hands on her apron as she came around the counter. "You came." "I was in town for supplies," he explained, suddenly feeling awkward and oversized in the cozy shop with its delicate displays of baked goods. I mean, the bread you brought was good. Thought I might get some more." Hannah's smile widened. "I'm glad you enjoyed it. I've just taken a fresh batch from the oven if you'd like to try something warm." Parker nodded, removing his hat and holding it awkwardly in his hands. "That would be nice." Hannah gestured to a small table in the corner of the shop. "Please sit. Can I offer you coffee as well? Or tea?" "Coffee, if it's no trouble," Parker said, settling into the chair she indicated, his long legs nearly bumping the table's edge. "No trouble at all," Hannah assured him, bustling behind the counter to pour a cup from a pot that was keeping warm on a small stove. She returned with the coffee and a plate bearing a steaming slice of bread topped with what appeared to be apple preserves. "On the house," she said when Parker reached for his wallet. "Consider it a thank you for escorting me home last week." Parker accepted the offering with a nod of thanks, taking a cautious sip of the coffee, which was far superior to the bitter brew he made himself before trying the bread. The combination of warm, yeasty bread and sweet tart apple preserves was so delicious that he couldn't suppress a sound of appreciation. Hannah beamed at his reaction, taking the seat opposite him. "I take it you approve." "It's—" Parker searched for words adequate to describe the flavors. "It's the best thing I've eaten in years." Hannah's expression softened. "You know, food tastes better when shared with others. It's not good for a person to eat alone all the time." Parker looked down at his plate, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I'm used to it." "Being used to something doesn't mean it's good for you," Hannah said gently. She hesitated, then added, "I know what it's like to want to shut yourself away from the world. After James and my son died, I barely left my house for months. My sister had to practically drag me out." Parker glanced up, surprised by her candor. "What changed?" Hannah considered the question. "I realized that isolating myself wasn't honoring their memory, it was just prolonging my pain. James wouldn't have wanted that for me. He was always so full of life, even after the war changed him." She met Parker's gaze directly. Is that why you stay out there alone? Because of what happened during the war? Parker's instinct was to shut down the conversation, to finish his bread and coffee, pay for a loaf and leave. But something in Hannah's eyes, understanding without pity, genuine interest without intrusion, made him pause. Partly, he admitted, surprising himself. It's easier, less complicated. Easier than what? Hannah pressed gently. Parker struggled to articulate feelings he'd never spoken aloud. Easier than explaining to people why loud noises make me jump. Easier than seeing the look in their eyes when they realize I'm not right. Easier than pretending I can just go back to being the person I was before I saw men blown apart beside me. He stopped abruptly, shocked at how much he'd revealed. Hannah reached across the table and placed her hand on his, her touch warm and steady. You don't have to pretend with me, Parker. I lived with James for 5 years after he came back from Shiloh. I know what the war did to men like you. I know about the nightmares, the anger, the guilt. Parker looked at her hand covering his, then slowly turned his palm upward, their fingers intertwining naturally. The simple human connection sent a current through him that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Why would you want to deal with that again? He asked quietly. You could have a normal life here, find a man who isn't. He gestured vaguely with his free hand, broken. Hannah's grip on his hand tightened slightly. First, I don't think you're broken. Wounded, yes, but not broken. Second, who said anything about dealing with you? I'm offering friendship, Parker. The rest. She smiled softly. The rest is up to you. The bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of another customer. Hannah gave Parker's hand a final squeeze before releasing it, and standing to greet the newcomer, a harried-looking woman with 2 small children in tow. While Hannah attended to her customers, Parker finished his coffee and bread, his mind whirling with unfamiliar emotions. When was the last time someone had touched him with such gentle understanding? When was the last time he'd admitted to anyone how the war had affected him? The fact that he'd revealed so much to Hannah after just 2 meetings was both alarming and somehow liberating. When the woman and her children left with a bag of fresh rolls, Hannah returned to Parker's table. I'm sorry about the interruption, she said. Parker stood, placing his hat back on his head. No need to apologize. It's your business after all. He hesitated, then added, I should let you get back to work, but I'd like to buy a loaf of bread before I go. The sourdough, if you have it. Of course, Hannah said, moving behind the counter to wrap a loaf for him. As she worked, she asked casually, will you be coming to town again soon? Parker considered the question. The trip to town had been less harrowing than he'd anticipated. The tight feeling in his chest had eased considerably during his time in Hannah's company. And the thought of tasting her bread again, of seeing her smile when he walked through the door, was surprisingly appealing. I might, he said cautiously. There's a cattle auction next week. I've been thinking of adding to my herd. Hannah handed him the wrapped loaf, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. Then perhaps I'll see you then. Parker paid for the bread, feeling a strange reluctance to leave. Thank you, he said, the words encompassing more than just the transaction. You're welcome, Parker, Hannah replied, her eyes conveying that she understood his broader meaning. Safe journey home. As Parker stepped back into the bustling street, the bread tucked securely in his saddlebag, he felt different, somehow lighter, as if a burden he'd carried for years had shifted slightly, allowing him to stand straighter. The noise and activity of the town still grated on his nerves, but it seemed more manageable now, less overwhelming. He mounted Thunder and turned the horse's head toward home, already thinking about the cattle auction next week and wondering what kind of bread Hannah might be baking that day. True to his word, Parker returned to Gila City for the cattle auction the following week. And the week after that, he found another reason to make the journey. By the end of the month, he was visiting town twice a week, each trip including a stop at Walsh Bakery for coffee and whatever fresh creation Hannah had prepared that day. Their friendship grew naturally over these visits, with Hannah sharing stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania and her dreams for her bakery, while Parker gradually revealed small pieces of his own history, his family in Virginia, his education, and occasionally brief mentions of his time during the war. Hannah never pushed for more than he was willing to give, and in her acceptance, Parker found himself increasingly able to discuss topics he'd avoided for years. As autumn crept across the Arizona territory, bringing cooler temperatures and spectacular sunsets, Parker made improvements to his cabin, fixing the leaky roof, replacing a broken window, adding a small porch swing. He told himself these changes were simply long overdue maintenance, but he couldn't deny the fleeting thoughts of how the place might look through Hannah's eyes should she ever visit again. One crisp October morning, Parker was repairing a section of fence when he spotted a familiar wagon approaching his cabin. His heart quickened its pace as he recognized Hannah at the reins, her hair loose around her shoulders and a basket beside her on the seat. "Good morning," she called as she drew closer, her smile brightening the already sunny day. "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. I closed the bakery today to work on some new recipes and thought you might like to be my taster." Parker set aside his tools, suddenly conscious of his sweat-soaked shirt and dirt-streaked hands. "I don't mind," he said, trying to keep the pleasure from his voice and failing miserably. "Let me just wash up." As Hannah descended from the wagon, Parker noticed she was wearing a new dress, a rich burgundy color that complemented her chestnut hair and fair complexion. She looked beautiful, and the realization that he thought so no longer alarmed him as it once might have. "Your cabin looks wonderful," Hannah commented, taking in the improvements as she gathered her basket. "The porch swing is a lovely addition." "Just fixing things up a bit," Parker said with a shrug, though her approval pleased him more than he cared to admit. "Come inside. The coffee's probably still hot." The cabin's interior had undergone as many changes as the exterior. New curtains hung at the windows, the floor was swept clean, and Parker had added a small bookshelf filled with volumes he'd ordered from back east. The overall effect was one of simple comfort rather than sparse utility. "You've been busy," Hannah observed as she set her basket on the table. "Keeps my hands occupied," Parker replied, moving to the wash basin to clean up. "What kind of recipes are you working on?" "Sweet rolls with cinnamon and pecans," Hannah explained, unpacking her basket to reveal several cloth-wrapped packages. "And a new type of bread with dried fruit and nuts. I'm thinking of offering them for the holidays, but I wanted an honest opinion first." Parker dried his hands and faced her, amusement tugging at his lips. "And you thought I'd be honest?" Hannah laughed, the sound filling the small cabin with warmth. "You're the most honest person I know, Parker Neill. You've never once pretended to like something just to spare my feelings." It was true. Over the weeks of their growing friendship, Parker had offered his genuine opinion on everything Hannah baked, though in truth, he'd found very little to criticize. Her talent in the kitchen was exceptional. They settled at the table, Parker pouring coffee while Hannah unwrapped her creations. The conversation flowed easily between them as they sampled the sweet rolls and bread, discussing flavors and textures with the familiarity of old friends. "These would sell well at Christmas," Parker said, reaching for a second sweet roll. "Especially to the miners. They're always looking for treats to send home to their families." Hannah beamed at his approval. "That's what I was hoping. The mining companies pay well, and the men are generous with their earnings." She hesitated, then added, "Actually, I've been thinking of expanding the bakery, taking over the empty space next door to offer more seating, maybe even simple meals at midday." "Sounds like a good plan," Parker nodded. "Town's growing fast. There's a need for decent food." "The only problem is the expense," Hannah admitted, her expression growing more serious. "I've saved some money, but renovating the space, buying additional equipment, it's more than I have on hand." Parker considered this. "Banks in town giving you trouble?" Hannah sighed. "They're not eager to lend to a woman on her own, especially for a business expansion. Mr. Hargrove at the First Arizona Bank suggested I might have better luck if I had a male business partner or husband to co-sign the loan." Her tone made it clear what she thought of that suggestion. Parker felt a surge of indignation on her behalf. Hannah had built her business through hard work and determination. The idea that her gender should limit her opportunities rankled him deeply. "That's not right," he said firmly. "Your bakery's the most successful new business in town. Anyone with sense would see it's a sound investment." Hannah's expression softened as she looked at him. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." A comfortable silence fell between them as they finished their coffee. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the scrub brush surrounding the cabin. The sky had darkened with approaching storm clouds, the air heavy with the promise of rain. "Looks like weather coming in," Parker observed, moving to the window. "Might not be safe for you to head back to town right away." Hannah joined him at the window, standing close enough that Parker could smell the faint lavender scent that always seemed to surround her. "Those clouds do look threatening," she agreed. "Would it be an imposition if I waited out the storm here?" "Not at all," Parker said, suddenly very aware of her proximity. "You're welcome to stay as long as needed." The first fat raindrops began to fall as they watched, quickly turning into a steady downpour that drummed on the cabin's roof. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a rumble of thunder that made Parker flinch involuntarily. Hannah noticed his reaction but didn't comment on it directly. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on his arm and said, "I've always found storms both frightening and beautiful. The power in them is humbling." Parker appreciated her tact. "My father used to say they were God's way of reminding us how small we are," he said, covering her hand with his own. They stood watching the storm for several minutes, the simple contact between them a comfort neither acknowledged aloud. When a particularly close lightning strike was followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder, Hannah jumped, moving instinctively closer to Parker. Without thinking, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. "It's all right," he murmured. "We're safe in here." Hannah looked up at him, her hazel eyes wide and luminous in the storm-darkened room. "I know," she whispered. "I feel safe with you, Parker." Something shifted between them in that moment, a boundary crossed, an admission made. Parker gazed down at her, acutely aware of every point of contact between their bodies, of the warmth of her pressed against him, of the slight parting of her lips as she returned his gaze. "Hannah," he began, uncertain what he wanted to say but feeling the need to speak. She reached up, her fingers gently touching his face, tracing the scar on his jaw that he'd carried since Gettysburg. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured. "Not unless you want to." Parker covered her hand with his, turning his face slightly to press a kiss against her palm, a gesture so intimate it startled them both. "I want to," he said hoarsely. "I just don't know how. It's been so long since I—" Hannah smiled, understanding in her eyes. "Since you let someone close." Parker nodded, throat tight with emotion. "I never thought I would again. After the war, I didn't think I deserved to." "Oh, Parker," Hannah sighed, her expression tender. "Of course you deserve happiness. Everyone does, especially those who have suffered." "I've done things, Hannah. Things I can't take back," Men died because of orders I gave, decisions I made. Hannah didn't look away or release him as he'd half expected. Instead, she moved closer, her free hand coming to rest on his chest, directly over his heart. "War forces impossible choices on good men," she said softly. "James told me once that the hardest part wasn't facing the enemy, it was living with himself afterward. But he was a good man, Parker, just like you're a good man. Your guilt proves that." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of emotion and long-suppressed need. Parker found himself lowering his head slowly, giving Hannah every opportunity to pull away if she wished. She didn't. Instead, she rose slightly on her toes, meeting him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, hesitant, a careful exploration rather than a passionate embrace. Parker's hands trembled slightly as they came to rest on Hannah's waist, and her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt as if to steady herself. When they parted, Parker rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed as he absorbed the magnitude of what had just happened, of the walls that had just crumbled after years of careful maintenance. "I didn't plan this," he whispered, needing her to understand. "When you came here today, I didn't expect." Hannah's soft laugh was like balm to his uncertainty. "Neither did I," she assured him, "but I'm not sorry." Parker opened his eyes, searching her face. "Neither am I," he admitted, surprised by the truth of it. He wasn't sorry, he was terrified, elated, overwhelmed, but not sorry. The storm outside began to abate, the thunder growing more distant, the rain lessening from a downpour to a steady patter. Inside, Parker and Hannah remained in their embrace, neither quite ready to break the spell that had enveloped them. "I should probably head back to town before it gets dark," Hannah said eventually, though she made no move to step away from him. Parker nodded reluctantly. "I'll ride with you." They prepared to leave in a companionable silence, both processing the shift in their relationship. As Hannah gathered her basket and Parker donned his hat and gunbelt, their eyes met repeatedly, small smiles exchanged like secret messages. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, leaving behind puddles that reflected the clearing sky and a freshness in the air that felt symbolic, somehow a cleansing, a new beginning. Parker helped Hannah into her wagon, his hands lingering on her waist longer than necessary. "I'll follow right behind you," he promised as he mounted Thunder. The journey to town was filled with glances and unspoken communications, both of them hyper-aware of each other's presence. By the time they reached Gila City, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the muddy Main Street. In front of the bakery, Parker dismounted to help Hannah down from her wagon. As her feet touched the ground, their bodies close, Hannah looked up at him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Would you like to come in for dinner?" she asked. "It's nothing fancy, but I'd like that," Parker interrupted gently. Hannah's smile could have outshone the setting sun. "Good." That evening marked the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Over a simple meal of stew and fresh bread, they talked more openly than ever before about their pasts, their losses, and cautiously, about their hopes. Parker spoke of the nightmares that still plagued him, of the guilt he carried for surviving when so many hadn't. Hannah shared her grief over losing her son, a pain that still caught her unawares on birthdays and holidays. As the evening wore on, Parker found himself reluctant to leave. The thought of returning to his solitary cabin, even with its recent improvements, held little appeal compared to the warmth of Hannah's company. "It's late," Hannah observed as she cleared their dishes. "The ride back to your cabin would be dangerous in the dark, especially with the road still muddy from the storm." Parker understood the implicit invitation in her words. "I could stay in town," he said carefully. The hotel, or you could stay here, Hannah suggested, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. I have a spare room. It's small, just a cot really, where I sometimes nap between early baking and opening the shop, but it would be more comfortable than the hotel. Parker considered the propriety of the situation. Gila City, for all its rough edges, still maintained certain social expectations. A single woman hosting a man overnight could lead to gossip that might damage Hannah's reputation and business. I don't want to cause talk, he said hesitantly. Hannah's expression grew determined. Parker, I'm 34 years old, a widow, and I own my own business. I think I've earned the right to offer a friend shelter without concerning myself with wagging tongues. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. But if you're uncomfortable, I understand. Parker covered her hand with his own. It's not that. I just don't want to bring any trouble to your door. Hannah's smile returned. I appreciate your concern, but I can handle a little gossip. Besides, her eyes twinkled with mischief, most people in town already think there's something between us, given how often you visit the bakery. Is there? Parker asked, the question slipping out before he could consider it. Something between us. Hannah's expression softened. I think you know there is, Parker. The question is, what do we want to do about it? It was the most direct either of them had been about their growing feelings, and Parker found himself at a crossroads. The path of caution urged him to step back, to protect himself from potential pain, to return to the solitary existence he'd carved out for himself. But another path beckoned one of connection, of possibility, of a future he'd long since stopped imagining for himself. Looking into Hannah's expectant face, Parker made his choice. I want to see where it leads, he said simply, if you're willing. Hannah's answer was to rise on her toes and press a gentle kiss to his lips. I'm willing, she whispered against his mouth. Parker stayed in the spare room that night, lying awake for hours listening to the sounds of the town settling into darkness and thinking about the woman sleeping just on the other side of the wall. For the first time in years, his thoughts about the future held hope rather than dread. The weeks that followed were a time of gradual but profound change for both Parker and Hannah. Their relationship deepened through shared meals, long conversations, and increasingly affectionate touches. Parker began dividing his time between his cabin and town, bringing freshly hunted game to Hannah's kitchen and helping with repairs around the bakery. Hannah introduced him to her regular customers, proud to have him at her side and untroubled by the occasional raised eyebrow or knowing smile. By mid-November, it was widely accepted in Gila City that the reclusive rancher and the widowed baker were courting, a development that surprised few who had observed their growing closeness over the previous months. One evening, as they sat together on the small bench behind Hannah's bakery, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, Parker broached a subject that had been on his mind. I've been thinking about your expansion plans, he said, his arm comfortably around Hannah's shoulders. For the bakery. Hannah looked up at him with interest. What about them? I have savings, Parker said carefully. Money I've put aside from cattle sales over the years. I don't spend much living out there alone. He cleared his throat, suddenly nervous. I'd like to invest in your business. Help you expand. Hannah sat up straighter, surprise evident in her expression. Parker, that's very generous, but it's a lot of money. I couldn't accept. It's not charity, Parker interrupted gently. It's an investment. Your bakery is successful, and with the expansion, it could be even more so. It makes good business sense. Hannah studied him, her head tilted slightly. Is that the only reason you're offering? Parker met her gaze steadily. No, he admitted. I want to help you achieve your dream. I care about you, Hannah, deeply. A slow smile spread across Hannah's face. I care about you too, Parker, more than I thought possible after James died. She hesitated, then added, "But a business partnership is a significant commitment. Are you sure?" Parker took her hand in his expression serious. "I'm sure about you," he said simply. "The rest is just details." Hannah's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she leaned forward to kiss him, a kiss that conveyed gratitude and affection in equal measure. "Then I accept your investment, Mr. Neill," she said when they parted, her voice slightly breathless. "And everything that comes with it." The following day, they visited the bank together, Parker's presence and financial backing ensuring that Hannah's loan application received immediate and favorable attention. Work on the expansion began the next week, with Parker overseeing much of the construction himself, drawing on skills he'd developed building and maintaining his own property. As December arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and holiday preparations to Gila City, the expanded Walsh Bakery was nearing completion. The additional space had been transformed into a cozy dining area with tables and chairs Parker had crafted himself, and a larger kitchen allowed Hannah to increase her production and offer a wider variety of goods. On the evening before the grand reopening, Parker and Hannah stood in the center of the newly completed space, surveying their joint accomplishment with pride. "It's perfect," Hannah said, squeezing Parker's hand. "Better than I imagined." Parker looked around at the warm, welcoming environment they'd created together. The walls were painted a soft yellow, the tables polished to a shine, and cheery curtains hung at the windows. It was a far cry from the sparse, utilitarian existence he'd maintained for so many years. "You did all the hard work," he said, drawing Hannah closer. "I just provided the lumber and muscle." Hannah shook her head, smiling up at him. "We did this together, Parker, just like we've done everything these past months." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "I never thought I'd find this again: partnership, happiness, love." The word hung in the air between them, spoken aloud for the first time, though it had been present in their actions for weeks. Parker felt a momentary surge of panic, followed by a profound sense of rightness. Yes, this was love different from what he'd known in his youth, deeper somehow, tempered by suffering and loss, but stronger for it. "I love you, Hannah," he said, the words feeling both foreign and familiar on his tongue. "I think I have since you showed up at my cabin with fresh bread and kind words." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "And I love you, Parker Neill, even when you were scowling at me from your porch with a rifle in your hands." Parker laughed, the sound free and unburdened in a way that still surprised him. Not the most romantic beginning to a love story. "I don't know," Hannah mused, wrapping her arms around his waist. "There's something to be said for a man who knows what he wants to protect. I'm just glad you eventually decided to include me among those things." Parker bent to kiss her, pouring all his newfound hope and happiness into the embrace. When they parted, both slightly breathless, he kept his arms around her, unwilling to let go. "Hannah," he began, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation, "I've been thinking a lot lately about the future, our future." Hannah's expression grew attentive, her eyes searching his face. "So have I." "The thing is," Parker continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact despite his discomfort with emotional declarations, "I don't want to just be your business partner, or even just the man who courts you. I want more than that, if you're willing." Understanding dawned in Hannah's eyes, but she remained silent, allowing him to find the words he needed. Parker took a deep breath. "Before the war, I had plans, a career, eventually a family. I gave up on those dreams a long time ago, didn't think I deserved them anymore." He touched her face gently, tracing the curve of her cheek. "But you've helped me see that maybe I was wrong, that maybe there's still a chance for happiness, for a life that's more than just surviving. He stepped back slightly, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small velvet box, a recent purchase from his last trip to Tucson. Opening it, he revealed a simple but elegant gold ring set with a single pearl. "Hannah Walsh," Parker said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Hannah's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely down her cheeks now. For a heart-stopping moment, Parker feared he'd misread the situation, moved too quickly, asked for more than she was willing to give. Then Hannah was in his arms, her face pressed against his chest as she whispered, "Yes, Parker. Yes, I'll marry you." Relief and joy surged through him as he held her close, his own eyes damp with unexpected tears. When Hannah looked up at him, her face glowing with happiness, Parker felt a peace he hadn't known since before the war, perhaps had never truly known until this moment. He slipped the ring onto her finger, pleased to find it fit perfectly. "It's not very fancy," he apologized. "I can get something more elaborate if you'd prefer." Hannah shook her head firmly. "It's beautiful and perfect, just like this moment." She examined the pearl, admiring how it caught the lamplight. "Why a pearl instead of a diamond?" Parker smiled slightly. "The jeweler told me pearls symbolize wisdom gained through experience. It seemed fitting for us, two people who have lived enough to know the value of what we've found together." Hannah's eyes softened with emotion. "That's lovely, Parker, and very true." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "When shall we be married?" "As soon as you'd like," Parker replied, turning his head to kiss her palm. "Tomorrow or next year, it's your decision." Hannah considered this. "Christmas is less than 3 weeks away," she mused. "What would you think of a Christmas wedding? The bakery will be closed that day anyway, and it would give us time to make proper arrangements." "Christmas it is," Parker agreed readily. The idea of beginning their married life as the year drew to a close, of starting the new year together as husband and wife, appealed to him greatly. They sealed the decision with another kiss, both marveling at how far they'd come since that first meeting months ago, from strangers connected by bread and kindness to partners preparing to join their lives permanently. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Gila City, met with general approval and good wishes. Sheriff Thompson seemed particularly pleased, claiming credit for bringing them together by suggesting Hannah visit Parker's cabin in the first place. "Always knew you two would suit," he told Parker with a wink during a chance encounter outside the general store. "Just needed a little push in the right direction." The preparations for the wedding proceeded smoothly, with Hannah insisting on a simple ceremony followed by a gathering at the newly expanded bakery. "Nothing elaborate," she said when discussing plans with Parker. "Just our friends, good food, and the promise of our future together." Parker agreed wholeheartedly. Neither of them needed or wanted ostentation. The significance of their commitment lay in its sincerity, not its trappings. As the wedding day approached, Parker found himself facing a decision about his cabin. He'd spent increasingly more time in town with Hannah, returning to his property primarily to tend to his cattle and maintain the buildings. The solitude that had once been his refuge now felt hollow compared to the warmth of Hannah's company. 2 days before Christmas, he broached the subject as they sat before the fire in Hannah's small living quarters behind the bakery. "I've been thinking," he began, his arm around Hannah as she leaned against his side, "about where we'll live after the wedding." Hannah looked up at him. "I assumed you'd move in here, at least for now. There's not much space, but we could make it work until we can afford something larger." Parker nodded thoughtfully. "That would make sense with the bakery being here, but I've been considering another option as well." He shifted slightly to face her more directly. What would you think about keeping both places? Living here in town most of the time, but using the cabin as a retreat of sorts somewhere we could go when we need a break from town life." Hannah considered the suggestion. "I'd like that," she said after a moment. "Your cabin has become special to me. It's where we first met, where we first kissed." She smiled at the memory. "And it would be good to have a place away from the business occasionally." Parker felt relief at her understanding. He wasn't quite ready to completely abandon the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the first place he'd felt safe after the war. This compromise would allow them to embrace their future together, while honoring the past that had shaped them both. "Then that's what we'll do," he said, kissing her forehead. The best of both worlds. Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, the desert landscape glittering with frost that would burn away once the sun climbed higher. In the small church at the edge of Gila City, Parker stood nervously at the altar, wearing a new suit purchased specifically for the occasion, and an expression of barely contained emotion. Sheriff Thompson stood beside him as his best man, offering quiet words of encouragement as they waited for Hannah's arrival. The church was modestly decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, filled with the surprisingly large number of townspeople who had come to witness the union of the reclusive rancher and the beloved baker. When the church door opened and Hannah appeared on the arm of Mr. Peterson, the elderly shopkeeper who had agreed to give her away, Parker felt his breath catch in his throat. She wore a simple gown of ivory satin, her chestnut hair arranged in an elegant updo adorned with small white flowers. She carried a bouquet of winter roses and desert sage. But Parker barely noticed these details. He was captivated by the radiant happiness in her face as their eyes met across the small sanctuary. The ceremony itself passed in a blur for Parker, though he would forever remember the moment he slipped the gold band onto Hannah's finger to join her engagement ring, and the clear, steady way she spoke her vows. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Parker kissed her with a tenderness that belied the passion building within him, conscious of their audience but unable to completely contain his joy. The celebration afterward at the bakery was everything Hannah had envisioned: warm, joyous, filled with good food and better company. Parker, who once would have found such social gatherings unbearable, discovered he was content to stand at his new wife's side, accepting congratulations and well wishes with a graciousness that surprised even himself. As the afternoon wore on and guests began to depart, Sheriff Thompson approached the couple with a wrapped package. "Wedding present," he explained, handing it to Parker. "Something I've been holding on to for a while, waiting for the right time." Curious, Parker unwrapped the package to reveal a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Opening it, he found it filled with handwritten entries, the first dated April 12, 1861, the day the Civil War began. "It belonged to my brother," Thompson explained quietly. "He served with the Union Army, same as you, though in a different regiment. Kept that journal throughout the war, right up until Appomattox." The sheriff's expression grew solemn. He came back changed, like so many did, struggled for years with what he'd seen and done. Parker handled the journal with reverence, understanding its significance. "What happened to him?" A smile broke through Thompson's serious expression. "He found his way through it. Met a good woman, started a family, found purpose again. Lives up in Colorado now, has 6 grandchildren." He clasped Parker's shoulder. "Thought his story might mean something to you now that you're starting this new chapter." Deeply moved, Parker could only nod his thanks, words temporarily beyond him. Hannah stepped closer, slipping her arm through his in silent support. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said warmly. "This is a truly meaningful gift." Thompson tipped his hat to them both. "You two take care of each other," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "That's all any of us can really do in this life." As the last guests departed and twilight settled over Gila City, Parker and Hannah found themselves alone at last, husband and wife in the quiet comfort of what was now their shared home. "Happy, Mrs. Neill?" Parker asked softly, drawing Hannah into his arms. Hannah's smile was luminous as she looked up at him. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she assured him, rising on her toes to kiss him properly, without the restraint they'd shown in the church. Parker returned her kiss with growing passion, all the love and desire he felt for this remarkable woman pouring through him. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed quietly. "After the war, I was convinced that part of my life was over, that I'd live and die alone in that cabin, with nothing but memories and regrets for company." Hannah touched his face tenderly. "And now," Parker smiled, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his usually serious features. "Now I have you, and a future I'm actually looking forward to. You brought me back to life, Hannah, with bread and kind words and a heart big enough to see past all my walls." "We brought each other back to life," Hannah corrected gently. "That's what love does at its best. It heals. It renews. It creates possibility where there was none before." As night fell completely and stars began to appear in the desert sky, Parker Neill held his wife close, marveling at the journey that had brought them together, from a war-scarred soldier and a grieving widow to partners bound by love and shared dreams. The path ahead would not always be smooth, he knew, but they would face whatever came together, stronger for having found each other when they needed it most. And it had all begun with fresh bread and kind words, offered to a lonely man who had forgotten how to hope. 5 years later, Parker stood on the porch of the cabin, watching as Hannah chased their 3-year-old son, James, around the yard. The boy's laughter rang out in the clear desert air, a sound that never failed to fill Parker's heart with joy and gratitude. The cabin had been expanded considerably, since their marriage, additional rooms added to accommodate their growing family. A proper garden established where Hannah grew herbs and vegetables, and a sturdy fence enclosing the yard to keep little James from wandering too far. Their life had found a pleasant rhythm, dividing time between the successful bakery in Gila City, now managed with the help of a young apprentice, allowing Hannah more flexibility, and their peaceful retreat in the desert. Parker's cattle ranch had prospered as well, providing a steady income alongside the bakery's profits. The nightmares still came occasionally for Parker, though less frequently now and with diminishing power. When they did, Hannah was there, her presence a balm to his troubled spirit. And on the days when grief for her first child caught Hannah unawares, Parker held her with the patient understanding of someone who knew that some wounds never completely heal, but become bearable through love and time. As he watched his wife and son playing in the late afternoon sunlight, Parker reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment, from the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg to this quiet happiness he'd never thought possible. "Papa," James called, spotting him on the porch. "Come play." Parker smiled and descended the steps, allowing his son to grab his hand and pull him into whatever game he and Hannah had invented. As he met his wife's eyes over their child's head, the love and contentment he saw reflected there matched his own. The war would always be part of him, as Hannah's losses would always be part of her. But they had built something new and beautiful from the ashes of their pasts, a family, a partnership, a life rich with purpose and love. And it had all begun with a widow who came bearing bread and kind words to a lonely cabin where a broken soldier had been hiding from life itself. "I love you," Parker murmured to Hannah as James ran circles around them. Hannah's smile was radiant as she took his hand. "And I love you, Parker Neill. Today, tomorrow, and all the days after." In that moment, under the vast Arizona sky, Parker knew with absolute certainty that some wars were worth surviving, if only to find the peace that waited on the other side.